Today we're going to cover the basics of using a faceplate and also faceplate rings. Most lathes come with a faceplate, so it gives you an opportunity to turn some things that you might otherwise need a scroll chuck for. Most wood turning, spindle turning, is turned between centers, between a drive center and a live center is shown here. But if you want to turn something that's face grain, where the grain is running perpendicular to the lathe bed, such as a bowl or a hollow form, where you've got to be able to hold it on one end unsupported with the other end, you need either a chuck or a faceplate. So I want to go into some details there. Hi y'all, I'm Mike Peace Wood Turning, and I'm passionate about wood turning, and I'm here to share with you tips, tricks, and techniques to help you become a better wood turner. So if that's what you're interested in, please click on the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any future videos. Some new turners may think of a faceplate as being kind of old school and they're replaced by scroll chucks. That's not necessarily the case. As I said, if you don't have a scroll chuck, you can use this approach. Even it's one that's been used for many, many years and works successfully. They come in different sizes. The one for my Powermatic is about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. The one that came with my little jet mini lathe is a bit over 3 inches. The one for my Laguna mini lathe is 3 inches. The larger jet lathes tend to come with one that's a 6-inch diameter faceplate. So that would hold some very large work. In addition, and I'll cover these in a little more detail later, you can also get what they call faceplate rings that are held in place by a scroll chuck that have the similar function of a faceplate. Now, the size of the faceplate does govern the size that you can safely turn. One of the advantages of a faceplate is that it gives a stronger hold than a chuck. You can hold irregular blanks, and they tend to have less vibration. So those are all positive reasons for using one. The biggest drawback is they're a little slower to use. But if you're not in a big hurry and you don't have a scroll chuck, or you've got very large irregular bowl blanks, or just large blanks in general, then the faceplate is the ideal solution. If we use a conservative approach to size, we want a faceplate that ideally would be about 1/3. The diameter of the faceplate would be about 1/3 the size of your blank. So looking at the chart in the faceplates and scroll rings that I have, this shows you the maximum size that could safely be turned. You could push these a little bit, and a lot of it has to do with how thick the piece is. Thicker pieces provide more leverage, and you would want a larger faceplate. So I have this beautiful Bradford pear blank. It was furnished to me by Larry Randolph, or a fellow YouTuber from Missouri, the Missouri wood turner, that's which having me and Sam Angelo involved in a project on turning bowl blanks. You can see this thing is approximately just a shade over 11 inches in diameter and just a bit over 6 inches thick. We're going to mark the centers, and the easiest way for me to do that is to use a template that I already have cut and to center it, and then I will use a awl. And this is going to be the top of the bowl, or the opening. Now, it's important that this surface be flat. This thing has been cut very flat, but if it's not flat, you're going to have to figure out a way to flatten it with a chisel or saw it or otherwise, because you need to have a perfectly flat surface for that faceplate to register on. This clip goes back where we're talking about a flat blank. You don't want the bowl blank to be rounded like this, because you're not going to get a secure hold. If you're cautious and you're only holding the blank for a limited period of time, and it's a smaller blank, you could shim those sides up, but I would tend to avoid that. I'm just going to center this. You could make a hole centering device the size of the opening. Unfortunately, this is for a 1 inch, not a 1 1/4. But I can eyeball it and it's going to get close enough. Alright, let's talk about screws. You want the screws to match your faceplate. Now for my Powermatic, that requires a 12-inch, a number 12 screw, which fits in there snugly, doesn't give too much wiggle room. That same 12-inch would not fit into this jet, which uses a smaller number 10, as does the faceplate rings I use from Record Power that require a number 10. Now, the other consideration is if you don't have a beveled hole, you've got a flat, you want a screw with a flat head to hold it firmly. If you've got one that's got a beveled head, then you want to use a wood screw that has a bevel that'll match that very closely. Now, I tend to get away with that a little bit on these faceplate rings because these sheet metal screws have rounded edges and they will fit in there just a little bit and makes it very snug. But it's not ideal. Now, in terms of the length of the screw, you don't need a really long screw. You don't need an 1.5 inch screw like this. You only need about 7 threads. Now that said, an ideal size for most of these, because most of these tend to be about a 1/2 inch, whether it's faceplate ring or a faceplate. Ideally, you need a 1 1/4 inch screw. I wound up with a bunch of 1 inches, so I'm going to use a bunch of them, and they will work. Although it's not ideal. The one thing you don't want to get is undersized screws like this wood screw here. They're just too much shimmy room. You also never use any type of drywall screws. They're just too thin and they're too brittle and they'll snap off. On green wood, you can drive these screws in without drilling a hole. An impact screwdriver does very well for that. It's for dry wood or for blanks that you're putting. If you're putting a dry glue blank on there, you definitely want to drill a hole. I'm going to show you why. One of the challenges of drilling a hole is most drill bits are too small to get in there very carefully. So what you wind up having to do is mark all the centers with an awl and then drill all the holes and then put it back on. Now, one of the things you need to be concerned about, this is the hole that we drilled in the wood by just using an impact driver, and you notice they're shards or little pieces of wood that got pulled up that were mushroomed and forced by the fibers getting pulled when you drill it in. You want to be careful because that can push against your faceplate and tend to push it away. If you drill the holes, you get a nice clean surface like this one that I drilled. Here's another example of the mushrooming that took place by driving these screws in into green wood without pre-drilling. You also want to be real careful not to over-tighten, because if you over-tighten the screws, you'll have a tendency to pluck up some of those fibers and reduce the strength of the hole, as well as increasing this mushroom effect. Another way to deal with this mushroom effect, if you're going to be using green wood, is you can countersink these holes on the back side so the mushrooming will have a place to go. For faceplates you have that come with your lathe, you'll never have this problem. But if you pick up a faceplate somewhere, there's a possibility you'll have one that the spindle is longer than the depth of the faceplate, and the spindle will wind up bumping against the wood and it won't register here, and that'll cause you real problems, because just like on a chuck, we need to have that faceplate registering against the face of the spindle. Because I'm using a little shorter screws than are optimal, 1 inch instead of 1 1/4, I'm going to fill just about every hole. Now I'm going to show you advantage of the face shield rings. First of all, I don't have a very large faceplate for this large blank, and from the chart we can see that I would want one that's close to 4 inches in diameter to safely turn a blank this large. But in this case I have this 5-inch diameter faceplate ring, and it's dovetailed to fit the outer dovetail on the scroll chuck. Now the big advantage to this is that I don't have to thread it on. All I have to do is simply lift it and then tighten the chuck jaws. So I'm going to put the orientation of that here and just lift this up. And then all I have to do is simply hold it in place while I tighten the jaws. And then I'm just going to turn it just to make sure that everything looks good, and it does. One of the reasons for needing a large faceplate is this blank is just so deep that you just get a lot of leverage out here when you're turning. I would have no concerns about using a smaller faceplate ring or a smaller faceplate, even turning a larger platter like this, larger in diameter, but the thickness is so much smaller you don't have the same leverage. You can use glue blocks mounted to your faceplates to attach blanks to, such as this large one on my Powermatic or a smaller one for a MIDI lathe with a 1-inch spindle. This might be a good time to also mention you can make your own threaded glue blocks. I won't go in, such as this one, or threaded faceplate, if you will. I won't go into details on this, but I'll have a link that you can link to where I'll go into details on making these threaded blocks. They're done by simply drilling a hole into a block of hardwood and tapping it with a specialty tap, which are not too terribly expensive. Beal makes these readily available at most of your wood turning suppliers or my Amazon shop. So faceplate rings, faceplates, threaded glue blocks, and woodworm screws. These are all good ways of holding a piece of wood unsupported on one end. For smaller bowls about like this, or maybe a blank like this, I wouldn't hesitate to use a woodworm screw. It's actually my preferred choice for smaller bowls. I've done a separate video on that, so if you're interested, click on the link. Y'all stay safe. Come on back here.